this special meeting of the Montana Geospatial Information Advisory Council. My name is Jenny Stapp. I'm the state librarian and chair of the council. We're going to start with introductions. I'll go ahead and start with introductions here in the room. Erin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Fashaway. I am the state GIS coordinator with the Montana State Library.
Genevieve?
Genevieve Lighthizer, admin specialist with the state library.
Evan Hammer, digital library administrator here at the state library.
Okay, and then for those of you online, Alan, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. From the council, Alan Armstrong here, from the Bureau of Land Management, Billings, Montana, federal government representative.
Thanks, Alan. Brian DeMarco.
Good morning, everybody. Brian DeMarco, board member.
Eric Spangenberg.
Good morning. Eric Spangenberg. I'm with Lewis Clark County in the city of Helena. I am the Montana, I guess I'm the Montana GIS professional representative on the council.
Thanks, Eric. Karen Coleman.
Good morning, Karen Coleman, GIS analyst with the DNRC and state government representative on the council.
And Lee.
Lee Mackholtz. I am the GIS manager for the city of Missoula, and I'm a state and local, or I'm a local government representative for the council.
And Maureen.
Good morning, everybody. Maureen Sealander, Custer County GIS manager, and I represent local government on the council.
Thanks, Maureen. Valentine.
Yeah, good morning. Valentine Hoff, work at the Fire Center at the University of Montana and represent the Montana University system.
And I apologize, did I miss any council members? This is always fun on Zoom. Okay. And then I would like, Melissa, if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Briggs, and I am the Central Services Administrator at the State Library.
Thanks, Melissa. And it looks like we have a few guests with us as well as staff. So thanks for joining us today. Today's special meeting is really to just answer any questions and to talk about what we are experiencing with the Montana Geospatial Information account and the revenue that we're collecting. And my hope for this meeting is that we can start to think about what we are seeing and how it impacts our geospatial information planning that we will begin in earnest when we meet in July. I'm gonna share my screen. Ooh.
Give me a second.
Genevieve will help me share my screen.
Okay, go ahead.
I think at this point, most of you have seen this revenue graph that has gone out in communication from the state library and in various forms of communication. And Melissa is able to answer any more detailed questions that you might have about the graph. It is normalized, which is why you don't see the y-axis, to reflect the fact that we did have an increase in our Geospatial Information Act fee, the recordation fee that we collect in 2021. And so we wanted to have the opportunity to display or show revenue under the fee increases compared to what would have been normalized revenue prior to when the fee was increased in 2021. And I will also note that the FY24 amount doesn't show the last couple of months of revenue that are still coming in. But as you can see, we have experienced a really drastic decline in revenue even lower than the normalized amount that we were seeing prior to the fee increase in 2021. And our staff, including Melissa and her team, spent a great deal of time over the last several months really trying to understand why we were seeing this decline in revenue, reaching out to local government clerks and recorders, as well as the governor's budget office. We attribute most of the declines in revenue to circumstances largely within the housing market. I think most of you are aware that the majority of the recordation fees that are collected at our local governments that fund this account are tied to some form of real estate transaction. And what we've realized is that there's really a perfect storm of factors that are coming into play that are causing us to see historically low collections. We have very high interest rates that are kind of freezing the housing market, coupled with extremely high housing prices. And related to the high interest rates, we're not seeing the refinancing that we had seen in previous years. And when houses are being purchased, in certain circumstances, they're being purchased with cash rather than mortgages. That also results in fewer actual pages being recorded for the transaction itself. So all of that combined is resulting in incredibly low numbers of pages being recorded. And this is something that's been reported by the clerks and recorders at the county level as well. We had hoped early on that perhaps there was just some kind of mistake or a misreporting going on. Perhaps some counties weren't aware of the doubling of the fee and we weren't collecting revenue that we should have been. But we do have confidence that the revenue that we are collecting is the revenue we should be collecting. And unfortunately, it is tied to a dramatic decline in the number of pages being recorded and therefore a significant drop in revenue. And so we've had to make some very serious decisions over the last several weeks about our current expenditures. And as you know, I'm gonna go ahead and let me pause there and ask if there's any questions about the revenue before I stop sharing this graph. Or Melissa, is there anything you might add?
No, I don't think so.
Hey, this is Brian. I apologize. So I guess that the revenue and housing, I guess I'm missing how it's, how does that, I guess, how do we generate our budget based on the housing?
Yeah, so our revenue is based on a per page recordation fee. So when there is a document recorded at a county with a clerk and recorder's office, $2 per page is deposited for GIS in the state of Montana. 50 cents stays with the county and $1.50 comes to the state library into the Montana Geospatial Information account. There are other fees associated with that recordation fee, and a lot of that stays with the local government as well. And real estate transactions drive the majority of the pages that are recorded in the local clerk and recorder's office. So the slowing of the housing market is resulting in a decline in the number of real estate transactions. Does that make sense, Brian?
It does. So does that account for 100% of our budget, or is there another funding source, or that is the sole source of funding?
For the GIS coordination work, that is largely the sole source of funding.
And I don't know, Jenny, I don't know if you want to give the brief history, because this all stems from originally from the Montana Land Information Act, and which was years ago, and it's just been renamed only recently into the Montana Geospatial Act. So I don't know if there's folks who may not know the full history behind where that money originated in terms of those filing fees.
Thanks, Eric. Does anybody have more questions?
Jenny, is there some kind of a report or something that you can be shared with us that shows, I don't know, where the expenditures have been, what any kind of the research and things that you guys have done? What I'm noting on this graph is that the revenues in fiscal 23 were significantly down as well. They're looks like lower than any other previous year. And having been on the council for as many years as this graph shows, you know, anytime we would have something that dipped down, we would be getting information. So I'm curious, why does this feel like it's the first time that we're hearing this? And what can we do? And maybe now is not the time for that particular conversation, but it is something that I wanna discuss. You know, how do we stay better informed with this?
I think that's a really fair question, Lee. I think part of the answer is that we had seen such a dramatic increase during COVID, and we had such a high cash balance. And that significant increase in revenue following just on the heels of the increase in collections, I think gave us a false sense of security in the amount of revenue that might be coming in and the amount of revenue that we had. And I you're exactly right. I think my hope for our ongoing discussions and planning is that we can recognize what may in fact be a new normal for us and understand what implications that has for communication and planning going forward.
Okay, that's fair. And I do want to recognize that a piece of that, you know, we used to get those financial reports at every meeting, and we determined that as a council that we didn't necessarily need
Lee, I think we're losing we can't hear you on our end.
Did we lose Lee?
Yeah,
There.
I think she just. Oh,
Hey,
Am I back?
You're back. You're back.
That was weird. Like I said, new computer. But so I don't want to jump ahead or anything, but are we going to in this meeting talk address the reserves and topics around that? Is that part of what you're going to bring to us today?
I think that's part of the conversation that we want to have with you.
Perfect.
Going forward. Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And
Well, then
I do just want to add that those financial reports are posted on our website and they're updated every quarter. Those are the reports that we take to our finance committee and to our commission. And as soon as those are approved, we post those on our financial dashboard. And there is a whole tab that's dedicated to this funding source. And there's a chart that also shows the cash balance that we have on hand at any given time.
Thank you, Melissa. I think definitely a piece in my part that I had failed to continue to look at those. So thank you.
I'll just add a little more, Lee, because I think what you're talking about in the past is probably just before the chart starts, around 12, 13, 14, we had a drop 30 to 40%, and we were constantly talking about that. And what I want to just emphasize, as Jenny said, we had the surplus. We have been cognizant of and trying to keep a balance there. And that's why last year, when collections were low, lower than they had been, if it had just been one bad year, we were in a good position to bounce back. it's having another even worse year on top of that that's really put us in this bind. So.
Yep.
Other questions about the revenue or revenue drivers?
Jenny, this is Karen. I feel like I'm having flashbacks and I might be misremembering, so you can set me straight, but is this the same? What I feel like at some point in the past that the funding was tied to oil and gas revenue, and that the bottom fell out of that, and then they switched to the recordation fees. Am I misremembering that?
Maybe in part. See if this answers your question. As Evan mentioned, this has been a historically somewhat volatile funding source. And in 2008, during that housing crisis, we were seeing fewer real estate transactions tied to housing. However, we did not experience the dramatic decline in revenue at that time. And we realized it was because of all of the oil and gas leasing going on, especially in eastern Montana, and the real estate transactions tied to that oil and gas leasing that bolstered the revenue more than we anticipated. And then similarly, when interest rates were at historic lows, we were seeing a significant number of refinances. And all of those refinances generated real estate transactions and recordation fees. None of that is occurring right now. And so we don't have other sources of transactions that are helping to bolster the revenue.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that makes sense.
I would we didn't really switch at that time. There's another whole thing. We used to have more coal severance tax in the library budget. And generally speaking, that has kind of phased out over the years. I think you may be combining the two there.
Probably, yes.
Other questions? So I want to kind of talk about where we need to go from here. And I do think we've been in a position to have to make some very immediate decisions. We, as you all know, decided the first decision we made was to not move forward with the 2025 MGAC grants. And then most recently, we decided that we should not extend any existing grants beyond our immediate obligations. Those would be the FY22 through FY24 grants. We at the state library have also been tightening our belt across the entire agency. To the extent possible, we're not spending dollars in FY24 that will help us to leave additional cash in the account. And then in FY25, we met last week with the Finance Committee of the State Library Commission to review the FY25 budget. And again, we're proposing to either cut or pause spending across the agency. And the amount of spending that we're proposing to reduce is about $1.6 million out of a $10 million budget. So that's a very, very significant amount of funding that we're having to cut or pause spending on. That includes the FY25 grants and some of the other projects that we've talked about with this council, like our GIS architecture work. We had been in the midst of planning for and migration and updates to our GIS architecture. That work is on hold. We've put on hold additional strategic planning work with Sanborn and some of the other major expenses that are funded with this revenue, largely in order to preserve the staff and the ongoing operations. We know that while painful, this drop in revenue is temporary. We don't know how temporary, but we do know that we will see a rebound in the future. And we want to make sure that by preserving the staff and the ongoing operations, that we have the infrastructure to continue to advance our work and then move forward when the revenue rebounds. So the commission will meet next week to consider action on the entire agency's FY25 budget. And that would include the expenditures out of the MGIA account.
I guess the finance committee or commission, is that made up of council members? Or is it a separate?
Yeah, it's a separate body. We report to a commission that's appointed by the governor, and it's 3 members of that commission.
Okay.
And most typically, in our planning process, when the council approves a geospatial information plan with a budget, that budget goes to the finance committee and the commission for adoption. So, you know, we did have a land information plan that had been recommended by the council with a budget that the commission adopted. The cuts that we're having to make are so deep and so immediate that we didn't have time to pull all those pieces together in order to bring something to the commission for this year.
As a procedural, is that something, and I guess I'm asking, I don't know where our involvement is or isn't, but it sounds like there's going to be a revised budget and maybe a balance sheet looking over the last, at least the previous year to see this year. Is that something we'll look at before it goes to the finance commission, or do we look at it afterwards?
For the FY25 fiscal year, they will consider action on that next week. So there is not time to bring anything to the full council for FY25. You will continue to get the financial reports. You'll get the closeout financial report for FY24, and then quarterly reports for FY25 moving forward. Starting in July, we want to start planning for the future geospatial information plan, which will contain budgets for future fiscal years. And it's at that point that the council is really involved in helping us identify the spending priorities that make up the budget for future fiscal years.
I guess I might offer, I guess, at least, feedback.
Please.
With the decline, it's been a decline for some time. And so the budget committee review process, I think, has failed. And so I guess I would ask, they maybe need to do a more maybe a more in-depth look at it. If it's been declining since 21 or 22, the projections didn't match where the budget was. I think there might have been a hope that it would rebound. And so so we're spending time allocating funding in future years with declining revenue in current years, but not necessarily matching or adjusting those. And so just awareness that I guess maybe the process, and there's not a lot we can plan until I think there's a revised budget for 24-25 and a review of balance sheet to fund other projects. If you're making cuts that are 10% annual budget cuts, to meet the current needs. So that's all.
Appreciate that, Brian. where I see this going, and please interrupt me if you have more questions or more thoughts. This feels like a bit of a new normal for us. I think, you know, we sort of had a pretty good understanding of what revenue looked like prior to 2021 and the level of volatility that we had experienced prior to 2021. And so when the legislature passed legislation that doubled the fee, I think we all breathed just a huge sigh of relief and thought that maybe we had solved that problem. And then, of course, we had COVID and we experienced the huge housing boom and had just a significant increase in revenue. And all of that felt really promising and encouraging. And I don't think any of us anticipated the really historic drop off in revenue that we've seen over the last 18 months or so. And so what I've been talking to staff about here and what I think we need to talk about with the council is sort of what you said, Brian, really having a deep understanding of what we think these projections look like, what amount of revenue we might consider our normal operating revenue going forward. And then if we have revenue and appropriation in excess of that operating amount, what are the priorities that we want to spend those dollars on? But doing so with some assurance that we have enough funding for ongoing operations and to Lee's point, some kind of reserve where if we see this drop off in revenue, there's at least some kind of cushion so that we're not in this kind of downward spiral of having to make these kinds of very, very rapid and unfortunate funding decisions. And that's a different way of budgeting than we've thought about before when we've approached our geospatial information plans.
I think we should look at, as we do that review, I'd like to look for some kind of some triggers or some metrics that we can set that will allow us, you know, kind of give us a threshold, like, you know what, something is changing here. What do we need to pay attention to? One of my primary concerns, other than, you know, maintaining and preserving, like you said, the staff and the operations piece, is with the grants, and how do we move forward in not having to cancel and not having to pull the rug out from under somebody whose work is in progress. So I'd really like us to work on some of those thresholds and some kind of a trigger that will give us a heads up so that, yeah, if we have to cancel a grant cycle, we have enough timing to do that so that people who are applying for those grants can look for other means, right? And that people who are relying on them and had approval for an extension have the ability to submit for budgets within their own entities or other grants. So that's one of the biggest concerns I have, is just making sure that we have something that'll trigger us to pay attention, you know, and not necessarily pay attention, but to have the conversation moving forward.
That's really important, both for the applicants and for all of you as council members and our staff for all the time that you put into doing that review.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 2016 timeframe, trying to reaching out to economists to try to identify something that could give us a heads up so we could prepare for this kind of issue. But if you look at that graph again, I think the really important thing to see here is that there's nothing in the history of collections that we could have analyzed that would have prepared us for what happened in the last 2 years. So I don't say that to say we shouldn't try. We absolutely need to try to find ways to provide more stability to the process. But this was a historic drop off, and that creates challenges.
And we've seen that over the life of this council is it's a relatively unreliable source of income.
Mhm.
Hence why I think it's important to set some things like, ooh, have a conversation here.
Yep. And also, you know, what should we be looking at in terms of income itself? You know, Melissa's been working closely with the governor's budget office. I've had conversations with people in the budget office, conversation with another legislator. So our next step after the commission meeting on Wednesday next week, where, well, they'll talk about the budget, is a quarterly meeting that we have with our interim budget committee of the legislature, where we will share with them more information about the declines in revenue as well, so that they are well aware of the decline in revenue and the impact that it's having.
Is there a notice or a link somewhere? Is that meeting with the library council, is that public? Is there something that we can attend to just to listen in on that one?
You bet. And the actual meeting notice and agenda will be posted tomorrow.
Perfect, thank you.
So again, I want to reiterate that really, I think the work of the council will start in July. And when we come together in July and talk about our geospatial information plan and that priorities, it will be with an understanding of what we think our projected revenue should look like and how we build a new budget around that projected revenue. And then, you know, what other kinds of priorities might we be thinking about and looking forward to, looking for other sources of revenue to support that kind of thing. Which is really, for those of you who have been on the council, sort of a new way of thinking about it. And for those of you who are new for the council, you won't really know anything different, but it'll be new for us. I talked to the state library staff a lot about this idea of being future focused and the need to think about where our work is going and how we want to continue to serve our stakeholders regardless of the funding that we have. We all know we never have as much revenue as we might like to have, and we all know that if we just had more money, we could do so much more with it. And sometimes that can be a source of frustration. But I think it's also an opportunity for us to really keep an eye to the future, keep an eye to the opportunities that we want to strive for, and think about when and how the opportunities for funding might present themselves. And again, that's just a slightly different way of thinking about our work and our work with the council, and something I look forward to hopefully defining more when we come together in July.
Could I ask that when we get together in July that we do a balance sheet review for the last 3 to 4 years?
Sure, Brian, we'll make a note of that.
Thank you.
You bet. Maureen, thanks for that information about your meeting with the clerk and recorder.
I appreciate that, the quarterly financial report, the dashboard that she sent. That was a huge drop between March of 23 and June of 23, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of the account balance.
So I think I dropped my meeting again in the middle of a comment a second ago. If we're still going on this topic, that's great. I have a question. If we can spend a couple of minutes to talk about the response by the grantees, anybody who was informed that they either would not be receiving funding, or if they had been granted an extension and then that had to be revoked. What is the response around that? is there, I don't know, what level of support do we have in terms of, I don't even know what I'm asking at this point. Talk about a little bit of what that response has been.
Tracking some of the communication
One
that,
sec, hold that, because let me double check the sound, because my computer did something right.
okay.
Sorry, one sec.
I have something, I couldn't get my thing off mute, but I have something to respond to the previous comment about the major drop off that happened over the end of a fiscal year. So that was part of our projection. So something that hasn't been talked about is the temporary short-term funding that was authorized to come out of this fund to help support and build the real-time network. And so the legislature appropriated 500,000 out of each fiscal year and in order to support and build out the real-time network. And so we expected to see a sharp decrease in the cash balance, the cash reserve of the MGA grant. I'm sorry, MGA funding. So that was expected because we knew that there was a short-term heavier reliance on that fund because of real-time network. And it just so happened that happened at the same time that there was this sharp decrease in the revenue. So it sort of covered up, it didn't make it as obvious to people watching the account balance that there was a bigger problem underlying. And so it was a perfect storm that happened all at the same time. And so I just wanted to give that information. There's more to the story there. So just wanted.
Yep, that's an important point, Melissa. Thanks.
I appreciate that, Melissa. Will RTN be reimbursing us? I guess. Or what's the plan? Because I see you look at the workbook and they're only 21% expended as of Q3. So are we expecting them to?
So that's the fund. I mean, you wouldn't reimburse that because that's an expense that makes sense to come out of that fund. So I don't know that these programs fall under the work of this council. So it's not necessarily a reimbursement. I don't think that that's an assumption that we can make.
Yeah. Eric, I would say that we are pausing expenditures for the RTN as well. We had planned to spend money on equipment to help continue to build out the RTN that we are not spending at this point.
Oh, okay.
And we're looking for additional funding to help with that.
Yeah. Lee, I think you were asking about what we're hearing from grantees and the impact that this is having on them. And I know, Aaron, you had collected some information based on our communication with grant recipients or current grant recipients or future grant recipients. I don't know if you want to share any of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty tough. This is unprecedented. And actually a lot of work was done. We started the grant process in November with education and training. And so I know that there were a lot of really extremely disappointed partners out there. They were very kind to me when delivering the news, but there are certain projects that are not going to happen now, like the NHD LE Hydro project up in Blaine County. That will not happen as far as I know currently, unless we try to find some potential partner funding. I have offered to Commissioner Shane Fox to try to help him discover some more funding, potentially from other state agencies or perhaps another federal program to not let it drop, because like I said, a lot of work was done and a lot of partnerships were a lot of work was put into partnerships and discovering the matching funds for that. There was a lot of disappointment in the cancellation and just a lot of questions about how the funding was collected, you know, basically why we had to cancel. We had a meeting this past week to discuss with the FY 23 and 24 grantees that we were no longer going to be extending grants, and we were able to answer questions about that. I think that was a shock as well, because we had promised extensions, and then unfortunately the budget did not allow for them. I think the grantees are scrambling to try to get things paid for and to do as much as they can with the news that they only had about 28 days remaining. So there was at least one grantee that had never started, so was counting on another full year. Some of them were just counting on a few months more. So you know, as I think is expected, it was disappointing, and I don't know what Missoula County will do moving forward with their fifth and final year of funding for Map Missoula project. Lee, I know that they're going to try to complete it and seek other funding, but where that funding is coming from, I'm not quite clear. So I contacted, in regards to the tribal grant, Brian, if you're interested, I did reach out. We let Fort Peck know obviously what was going on, and I reached out to Wally Gladstone, who is one of their contractors, and he had indicated that they probably were going to be able to finish, even though they were expecting a grant. So they had a significant amount of work done. And when I say grant, I meant grant extension. So I think everything, as you would assume, was kind of expected in some of the conversations that I had with grantees.
Is there any other kind of support that we can offer you in having those conversations, or are you getting what you need in terms of, you know, the time to explain and any contacts that you need with those grantees? I guess what can we do to help?
I guess I would say, if you know grant recipients and you have an opportunity to reach out to them, just asking them if they have any questions, referring them to us if they do. Certainly if you're able to answer them, fantastic. If not, referring them to us. I would much rather know that we are answering people's questions rather than having the questions linger or potential misinformation be communicated. I think that's really important. The communications that have come to me have largely been resolved when I've been able to just explain the situation. And so the more correct information we can make sure that people have, I think the better.
Just want to add too, so that it's clear for everyone that's listening. We did not, if we had an obligation, the state library did not default on that obligation. So all of the grants that are currently open we will continue to take invoices, and those grants will continue until the date on the contract. So these are supposed to be 1-year grants anyway. And so in the past, because of COVID and delays and things of that nature, we had previously offered extensions to grants if people weren't able to get supplies or work, or contractors, etc., to complete the grants due to COVID. So that is sort of still happening. There's some overflow of that still happening. So several of these grants were from FY22, some from FY23. And so we just made the decision to not write a new contract and extend that. So we are honoring any grant and continuing that through the period, the term that was signed on the contract. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear for everyone.
Thanks, Melissa. That was going to be a follow-up question that I had, so thank you.
So it's just the ones that were originally funded for 24 that we're holding off on?
Yeah, but we didn't sign, so we had gone through the process of asking for the applications, and that is, you know, I will agree on every point that the timing is really terrible because people put in a lot of work to apply for these grants. And then we had to make the decision going forward into next year that we aren't able to offer those grants. So the timing on that is terrible, but there was never any contract signed that we won't be defaulting on any grant that we've agreed to. So we are just pausing on awarding those grants for next year.
Were any of those, so are we funding commitments through 24 or through 23?
Through any contract that we had signed through FY 24, we will meet those obligations.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's still time, right? I mean, I get it, the start and the stop, but maybe in July, I guess that gives us an opportunity to figure out maybe how we solve the problem. For 25, what is that number that we would need to fund those?
We had grant obligations a little over 200,000.
Thank you.
And at the point that the revenue does rebound, you know, we will be prepared. We have the authority and the appropriation, so we can spend from this fund if cash does come in. So at the point in the future, when revenue does rebound, we can make those decisions, but those decisions will happen at an agency-wide level because we've made cuts across the entire agency. So we'll need to look at the priorities on all of the things that were, all of the spending that was reduced.
And
one of the things I just want to also add is that the choices that were made to reduce spending across the agency was because we have identified that this is a short-term reduction in funding, and it is our priority as an agency to retain the GIS staff and the professional knowledge and expertise that we have, because that is our most valuable asset that we have. And so, you know, I just want everybody to understand that we made cuts across the entire agency that because we value and want to retain the staff. And so I hope that helps give some insight.
Thanks, Melissa.
So I'd just like to add a comment as a grant recipient and a council member. We've had grants in fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24. And we did get an extension in 23. We finalized that one. And we did request an extension for 24. But as far as I'd like to speak to the timing actually wasn't completely horrible, because we are just going into creating our new budgets. And so that wasn't something that actually got put into the budget yet, because you guys came out so quick and let us know what was going on. And so that actually was a big help for me anyway. I can't speak for other grant recipients, but as a grant recipient, I mean, I appreciate all the work you guys have done and all the help we have received. And Matt and Aaron both have been honest and forthcoming with all the information and answering all the questions we've had. And so I'd like to commend you guys. I mean, I think that it's a hard thing that you've had to do, but when you came out with it and told us right away, that was honestly the best thing you could have done.
Well, Maureen, thank you so much for sharing that. That's very gracious. I appreciate that.
Lee, one more follow-up on what we had done or what we can do is, I did reach out to several grant recipients that I thought, were eligible. And, the prioritized grant, or applicants from 25 to seek their interest on working with the Secretary of State's office to potentially go after some funding, the HABA funding, the Help America Boat Act, where some of the tasks and goals of their projects could apply. And so we had started the process of saying, hey, we know there's this other pot of funding here. Are you interested? And then I will work with them to, I guess, have an information sharing session, perhaps with the Secretary of State's office, and then all the MSDI leads that are involved in the MSDI layers that contribute to the GeoNaval Elections Initiative. And so there could be a little bit of relief there, and some of the project work might be able to move forward under the HABA funding.
Thank you for that effort.
So I just want to reiterate, we have our meeting coming up in July. Can somebody remind me the dates?
The 11th.
The 11th, July 11th. And we had already talked about really dedicating that day to our planning and our thinking about the process for a revised geospatial information plan. And I think I appreciated Brian's suggestion of really taking a deeper dive into the financials before we do that planning work. I think that's important. And then thinking about what are the immediate priorities for funding when revenues rebound? And then what kind of planning do we want to have in place that will give us kind of a reserve or a cushion? And taking that recommendation to Melissa and the Commission Finance Committee, and then how can we use the information we have and the experiences that we're going through to inform a future geospatial information plan budget and what that looks like. So those are I think the three important topics that we need to really be sure that we're addressing when we approach our geospatial information plan budget. We have about 5 minutes left. What other questions, comments, concerns do you have?
Melissa mentioned this, and I just want to say I'm really grateful, appreciative that library to Jenny and Melissa, but also to all the staff. Certainly appreciative of the GIS staff, but outside of the GIS area that are also taking cuts, and the positive approach that they've taken to this, the opportunity to help out. So just really appreciate that.
So in terms of preparing for our meeting in July, so we've got the quarterly report. Can we, I know we've just got a couple more minutes. Melissa, can you walk us through just a really quick, how do we read and understand this so that I need to understand what's being held as the reserve? What is the budget from the land plan versus what's being collected and what's being spent? And I get lost in these financial reports sometime. Can you just give us a really quick run through of how to read this report so that I'm reading it correctly?
So if you're looking at the agency-wide budgets, then the answer is no, I can't explain that very quickly. But what I will say, just, and we can make time another time when we have many more minutes to discuss that. But as far, so what your CIA is funded by many sources. The only fund that you all have, you know, purview over is the MGIA fund. So it gets complicated because we have many funds across the agency that do in fact support all of these different programs. And all of those are tracked separately, and those amounts change with each year. And so it's a constant juggling and balance act to decide, okay, here are the work priorities this year. Here are the different funding sources available, and how do we want to adjust those to maximize the support that we can provide. And we do that across the entire agency. So that includes not just MGIA funded projects, that includes on our library development side as well. And so it's a complicated process, and it changes every year. It changes as cash availability changes, and then you throw in the legislative session and things really change. So what else to say there besides, if you want to talk about the budget, then we should definitely have that conversation outside of an MGAC meeting. And I also don't know if that's really time well spent. Maybe we should spend more time talking about the revenues just in this specific in this specific fund, and how those fluctuate with the market, and how, because there isn't a way to we can project, but we can guess, but I'm not an economist, and I don't have a way of knowing what the market's going to do. And there are many influences, that I'm not an expert on. So we can talk about that, because I think there's definitely room for improvement on getting revenue estimates going forward. Although, like Evan said, like when you have an anomaly thrown in, like that doesn't really help anything anyway. So
yeah, all that is understood, and that is helpful because I look at this and I'm going, well, how do I understand this? So the recognition that this reporting is a much broader than just the MGIA piece is helpful.
And one of the things
if I can come up with a more specific question, then I will be in touch. I know our time is pretty well up here, so I will try and get it dialed into what is my specific question.
Okay. And as far as looking at this line chart here, you are literally looking at the statistic that should be thrown out of a financial analysis, because you're looking at COVID, and then you're looking at the real-time network being added into the fund, and then you're looking at the lowest decrease we've seen in the history of this fund. So this entire 5-year piece that we're looking at, it would be a statistical garbage. It would be what would be thrown out. So we're just in that period of time where nothing is normal right now.
Yeah, understood. Okay, thank you.
I want to thank all of you for your time and your really good questions and really good feedback. And I look forward to having a really in-depth conversation with all of you in July. I want to ask if there is any public comment. Is there any public comment? Hearing none, we'll adjourn our meeting and we'll see you all in July. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.